Here's a writing project that is easy to do and of high value to organizations. As a copywriter or a marketer, you're perfectly aligned to address this particular type of document, and it's very powerful for the organizations you serve. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips, where we talk about the business of copywriting and the opportunity that's there to go from a freelance copywriter to an agency. Now, this particular document that I'm talking about is usually called a communications plan, editorial guidelines, or some kind of plan that governs how an organization will communicate with the outside world. So I create a lot of policy documents as well as some technical writing in addition to the copywriting that I do. Now, most of my clients are knowledge workers, they're technology companies, they're science type organizations. But I want to introduce you to this particular type of document because it's not only valuable for the organization, but it is an ongoing opportunity for you as a consultant. Now, you can make good money doing this inside of an organization or for a large commercial organization or even a large nonprofit, but it's also something you might do for a local nonprofit should you get into a situation where you're the blog master or you're contributing articles. Because this type of document clarifies what kind of information they're going to publish, what audience do they publish to, what channels of communications are authorized for publishing, as well as some of the content approvals, rights, and submissions. Because the big challenge of organizations today is that you could publish content on your website and then some legal bot come find it, and now they're suing your organization for $1,000, $500. Now, from the legal side, they'll sue thousands of organizations for this much, and a lot of organizations will cave, but there is the potential for a copyright violation, even if it is unintentional. And what I find with a lot of organizations is they believe they can just start throwing content online and see what happens. And that's really not how you first communicate a clear message, or second, maintain the a low level of risk that allows you to publish with minimal friction. So, what am I talking about here today? I'm talking about the editorial guidelines. Now, again, you can call it a communications plan, you can call it a lot of different things, but an editorial guidelines, in effect, is the guidance that you need as a copywriter to write sales and marketing materials, as well as anybody who's creating content with inside of an organization. So, it's going to talk about the organization itself. It's going to talk about the approach the organization is taking to their external communications or even their internal communications. It'll talk about copyright usage. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it seems a lot of people, including some clients of mine, are not understanding this, but everything you publish online needs to be backed up by a ledger that keeps track of where the sources came from. So if I use an image on a web page or for a thumbnail, there is somewhere in my project folder a list of where that content came from so that if I ever get a takedown notice, I can see whether I'm using public domain content, whether I'm using common rights content, whether I'm using some other copyright rule. And by the way, I could download something from the EU just as easy as downloading something from the United States and end up with with an EU sanctioned court or privacy or whatever problem. I'd rather not have these problems, and the editorial guidelines solves many of these problems for the organizations. So, what is a copyrights ledger? It's simply a single location where you're going to keep track of content submitted to your organization to publish, the name of the authors or the original rights holders, licensing agreements. Maybe it even is a folder that includes copies of all your licensing agreements for your stock photo sites or for your other things. Um, but again, who approved the content to go on online. So I know this sounds a lot like a newsletter or kind of a journal publication, but again, the customer for this is a large organization that has a marketing department or a public relations department, and this is the back end structure that helps keep them out of trouble. Nonprofit organizations that have outreach or recruiting, or even newspaper publications or other types of publications. The concepts here are about protecting and standards. Protect the organization from outside threats, such as uh, posting personally identifiable information on your website and then getting sued by a state government because it's against the privacy law for that state. Protects the organization from content that hasn't been properly reviewed that creates some kind of legal liability. So maybe you have content on your website that makes a claim that this product will cure cancer and improve your stamina and increase your testosterone levels, and then it turns out that those claims are not valid in the marketplace. So again, the editorial guidelines would have the steps for how do you approve those things. Another factor we want to look at is the legal releases. So, for example, if you're writing content or you're writing a guideline for a seminar organization, they need to get a release from every attendee on sign up rather than once they're at the event, because if you don't have a release, you can't pan the audience for audience shots. Now, if you're in a public place, yes, you can pan the audience, but these people are attending an event, very often wearing name tags, and so you can't just turn the camera around and look at the audience unless you first got a legal release. Now, the editorial guidelines would have how do we get legal releases? So in the case of a seminar organization, we get the releases before people show up. In the case of a training program, you can do the same thing. In the case of a public event, where do we get the media releases? Well, if it's a public event, you don't necessarily need media releases unless you're individually identifying people, because there's no expectation of privacy at a public event. However, what's the context of the organization? If you're writing for a nonprofit organization that does advocacy, there are times that people in the audience don't want to be associated with the organization. They'll support it, they'll come out to a conference, but they don't want their name associated with it. So, what's your policy? Again, that's why we put together the editorial guidelines. A couple other areas here that are more on the copywriting and marketing side is a clear definition of your audience segments, modes of communications, any outside regulations associated with your communications. So, for example, if your organization is sponsored by a university, that university is going to have their own communications plan or communications policy in which you need to reference, because you have to follow that as well. And then, of course, the university itself is under federal and state guidelines, so you have to be aware of those as well. Now, I'm not saying you as a copywriter or a marketer need to be uh, up to date on all these legal concepts, but you do need to know in the organization who to talk to. Now, this solves your problems in a couple different ways. Now, what's your problems? Well, your problem is getting your work approved. Uh, Second is knowing who to communicate with. And what I'm arguing here is if you help the organization write their editorial guidelines or their communications plan, you're going to get to meet all the people who make these decisions. So you're going to go in and say, well, who's the audience that we serve? Okay, well, you're going to have to talk with our outreach coordinator to see what kind of people we're looking for to become new members. Great. Uh, but our board has communications as well. Great. I'll go talk to the board as well. So communications coming from the board, what is the guidelines that govern those communications? What types of communications? Who's the audience they're talking to? And then, of course, the same thing with the outreach. So you could, in effect, uh, reach a large part of the organization that would allow for follow-on work. Another factor too is that clearly identifying your audience segments makes it easier for you to write copy. Because, for example, if your audience is existing members, let's say you're working for a trade association and one of their audiences is existing members, great. What kinds of things are existing members interested in? Now you got your topics for your content. What about potential members? So in your recruiting side or your outreach side, what is the interest of potential members? And finally, you also have sponsoring organizations or partners. If your trade association is is gaining outside revenue from exhibitors, advertisers, sponsor organizations, then what kind of communications are relevant for those people? Now, as a copywriter, seeing this on paper and helping them organize this, now the business understands they have different kinds of audiences which need different messages. So you might write a sales letter to sell a product, but you may also want to add a news release that promotes the organization having the product. The news release isn't targeting the customer, it's targeting the investor, it's targeting the partner organization, it's targeting sponsor organizations. Can you see how this kind of depth is really good to set you up for success? It not only sets you up for success, but it also helps the success of the organization because now their communications are consistent, clear, and following a simple guideline. Now, these guideline documents don't have to be very big. In fact, I like to write them in an outline form And then when I sit down with the organization, we'll expand that out where necessary. And I'll give you a little bit of content here towards the end out of the one that I'm working on right now. Another factor that's important is content approval. You don't just willy-nilly put content on websites. I know there's a lot of times when companies get caught putting something stupid up, like the Valencia ads, they go up online and people are like, "Oh my gosh, this is offensive," and it turns out they just claim that they didn't know it was going online. You know, the ad agency did the work. Now, I don't want you to get blamed for a controversial campaign because you and I know that all marketing campaigns get approved by somebody. Why not write that down and put that into the editorial guidelines? So, in the case of a nonprofit organization, they may not release any content or publish articles through the blog or go on social media with long form materials unless it's the author plus one committee member has or committee chairperson has looked it over. If it's a scientific publication, you may want the author plus some kind of subject matter expert to look over the materials before you publish. That's why you're going to fact check it. You're going to make sure it makes sense. And then in the case of board communications, you want two or more board members to be able to approve it. And those are just examples. Every organization will be different. And it's very important that not only you find out how do they approve content, but you put it in the guidelines. Now, again, this is a parallel path here. You're helping the organization become more organized, to be more consistent with their communications, to have fewer challenges because some cases they need legal approval, and then ultimately you're finding out who the decision makers are. So I know a lot of folks they're pitching sales letters and lead generation pieces and press releases. They miss the opportunity to write the framework for an organization that helps that organization be more productive with your copy. Now, there's another factor, especially for organizations that accept outside content, such as a newspaper, magazine, or other publication. And you might think that these organizations have these types of documents. They don't. You offering to write this kind of document or pitching the importance of this document is actually going to help you get in the door more ways than you can imagine because some of these materials are heavily disputed, they're out of date, but it's all information you need to know as a copywriter. But when somebody's submitting content to an organization, I was recently working with an organization that didn't understand this, um, is that author retains the rights to the original materials, and then the materials are submitted to a publication, and then the publication has the right to accept those materials for publication. Um, but if it doesn't do certain things, it won't own the copyright for the use of that material, and then future use or enhancement or changing of medium or other things are not allowed if you don't properly have submission guidelines. And so in this case, I'm writing this for an organization who individuals can get volunteer hour credits for writing materials for the newsletter or for the blog. And so I'm making it clear if you're getting volunteer credits, then the copyright of the materials is owned by the chapter and they retain non exclusive rights to the materials. So you can write the materials, and in the United States, your copyright is owned by the individual who writes the original materials. But now, if you're writing those materials and being compensated through volunteer hours or pay, the organization owns the materials. Okay, my contract is completely different, but the organization is going to want to own those materials because if they excerpt from those materials or they change the format, they don't want to have to go get permission from somebody else. And another case here, and I'm not going to go through the whole rights and submissions here, but I want you to understand the importance of this being there is that if the organization does not accept those materials, the original author gets to keep the materials. So if somebody submits an article to a publication and 12 months have gone by and the organization has decided not to use the materials, then the individual who submitted the materials, the rights revert. But it's very clear that the submission of the materials is a transfer of rights or a assignment of rights, and that the organization is allowed to use those materials. Now, if something came up in court and there was an image, a photograph, there was an article, there was some kind of complaint, and the organization gets sued, the editorial guidelines provides evidence that your organization did not intend to violate somebody's copyright, but the organization instead has certain guidelines, and those guidelines were followed. That's where we talk about the copyright ledger. So when did you receive it? Where did it come from? And then, of course, and how it's used, we have the guidelines. And then ultimately, we have some standing to just simply take down the content. In most cases, you can avoid legal problems by simply just taking down the content, but demonstrating that you didn't intend to violate it. So again, there's elements in here about giving credit. So if you have a member organization and a member has done something, you do want to give them credit. Um, there's possible questions that will remain unanswered from the editorial guidelines. That's okay. You can put that section in there. But ultimately, as a marketer, as a copywriter, the first thing you want to ask an organization is, do you have a communications plan? Do you have editorial guidelines? Okay. Before I'd even think about writing for your organization, I want to make sure your organization has some of the basic things that are necessary for consistent communications, for accurate communications, and a reduction of liability, because I want to understand your business. If they have this guidelines, you're going to be looking for the audience definitions, the communications models, different segments of audience, how they approve content. And now you're ready to do business with these people with the least amount of friction. And in fact, with a properly written editorial guideline, you're now working in a more of a partnership. You'll be more aware of future content needs, and the organization can bring you on as a more regular player in their long-term planning. Now, some organizations have these guidelines. You can find them easily on their website, or you can find them in the internal documents. I've worked with some clients who I asked for an editorial guideline and they just gave it to me. They had it. It was very well done. It made my life so much easier. But ultimately, it meant that I produced materials that were more congruent with their expectations and their means of approval. So if the client says, oh, we can't approve this content, it doesn't fit our needs, I don't have that problem because I read their editorial guidelines, I read their policy, I made sure the document was compliant. In the case of writing content for organizations that do have legal departments, very often when I'm writing technical materials or policy materials, I can just look it up in their policy library. I don't have to, there isn't any trial and error. I basically can just look it up. Now, again, the opportunity here is with mid-sized organizations who have a large public media a public media exposure, trade associations, nonprofits, foundations, corporations. Many of these people won't have an editorial guidelines. It can be a four-figure or a five-figure deal. It depends on the size of the organization and how much traffic they have on each mediums. What I found with a lot of nonprofits, a lot of smaller chapter level organizations, is they don't have a huge audience. Their website gets a few thousand visitors a year. Um, it's important just to get them an outline, get them focused in one direction. But local manufacturers, individuals who are marketing through social media, they may end up with a 4 or 5 page editorial guideline. And even if it's in draft or an outline, it's that single point of focus for how we do things around here. And it's meant to be broad, but it's also meant to make it easy to know what to expect when you're producing content, whether it's internally or externally. So the benefits here for the client are consistent communications to the outside and inside world, identification of audience to make sure you're serving those needs, the rights and copyright legality elements, and finally making it kind of streamlining their content plan. Now, you can add on top of this a content marketing plan or updates to their marketing plan or other areas, but the simple guidelines, the communications plan is going to reveal so much to you as a copywriter to allow you to suggest credible and valuable projects that you can be doing for them, but it's also going to simplify the life of your decision makers, of your audience. It's going to give them confidence that you're going to write good materials. You're going to write materials that are fit and function for their organization, and that is a win for everybody. I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. If you have any questions about what we've covered today, you can visit www.adbriefings.co.uk, where you can go to the contact page and ask your questions. I would love to hear from you. And then if you have any ideas on selling the editorial guidelines that I haven't mentioned here or the benefits of editorial guidelines, do mention those in the comments below. I do try to look out for the comments, but also you can contact me through the website www.adbriefings.co.uk, where we help copywriters and marketers, especially freelance ones, grow their business into a small agency or at least a boutique firm where you're getting rewarded for your creativity and knowledge. Thanks for listening.